Welcome to the URM podcast. Our guest today is Austin Coupe, who is an up-and-coming producer-songwriter known for his work with bands and artists such as Echo, Moodring, Prison, Nothing Nowhere, Citizen, and a bunch more. I kind of think that Austin is the new school. He's absolutely the new school. When I think of the new school of producers coming up from kind of the world that was created since Joey started doing his thing, and since URM came on the scene, I kind of feel like he is this new school just kind of crushing it in the world. So let's get into it. Here goes. Austin, welcome to the URM podcast.
Yeah, it's cool to be here, man. URM might as well have been my church, years ago, so I'm stoked to be talking to you guys.
How so?
I would just listen to the podcast literally every day, just trying to learn and listen from all these legendary people you'd have on like that. I used to be in the gym. Yeah, used to be in the gym every day, just listening, trying to learn anything possible,
Okay,
awesome.
I need to know about that. Is awesome, but I need to know about the learning at the gym thing because
yeah,
we've had several people who say that they watch Nail the Mix at the gym or listen to the podcast at the gym, and to me personally, it would be the last thing I want to listen to when trying to set a PR or something. So how is it more just absorbing information over time kind of thing, or just always having that on your mind while you were in that developmental phase?
I think for me, it was more about trying to make the best use of my time. It's hard enough to spend, hours out of your day trying to do something. So why not try to stuff it into when you're going to be in one place for an hour to an hour and a half, Yeah.
So I can imagine that was probably a time period when any available moment you'd be finding some way to get audio information in.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Especially because back at that time, my main thing was being in a touring band. So if I was at home off tour, I was doing as much audio as possible,
How did you keep up with it while on tour?
I didn't. I just would do it only when I wasn't touring. I know some guys who would do laptop on the road, but at the end of the day, everybody I know, or not everybody, most people I know would say that they can't really do the audio stuff to their full potential on tour,
Way too many distractions on the road.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, even just the fact that you can't sit in front of monitors in a nice room, you're kind of stuck in headphone land.
Yeah, and for me, anytime I tried to work on the road, it's just hard to get really zoned into what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean,
that's the main thing.
At any given time, you could be asked to go, move your gear or set up your gear on stage or help do merch stuff or go run an errand for somebody. There's just no guaranteed set time that you're going to be, uninterrupted. So
basically you had to deal with it, deal with learning how to do it in very limited time periods.
Not even necessarily limited time periods, because I wasn't touring more than 4 to 6 months out of the year. But it was more just when I'm home, there is no other thing that I'm interested in doing or care about putting my time into. So, watching YouTube, reading articles, just working with as many local bands as possible, watching URM at the gym or listening to URM at the gym. It was just kind of inject it all into my veins, please. You know what I mean? I was just trying to get better as fast as possible at this point. And I'm thinking this is probably 2016 or so, 2016, 2017.
That makes sense. How long was it before, I don't know, how long of putting in that kind of obsession before you started to notice that other people started to notice?
Yeah, and what's really funny about this concept is So I started doing audio, in terms of maybe I could do this as a real thing, probably around 2014, 2015. Do you guys remember a guy named Kenny Gill?
Yes.
So Kenny was like the guy in Tampa, Florida, and he used to record my old band's stuff. And he was the first person who was kind of like, hey, I know you like to do recording at home. I know you record all your band's demos and whatnot. Would you ever want to start engineering for me? And so he's kind of the one who like started showing me the ropes. Like 2014, I did some stuff for him when he was doing like some Metal Blade records, and I was like engineering for him. So that was like my first taste of like, hey, here's how you edit guitars for real. Here's how you set your mic preamp so you're not clipping and all this stuff. And because I've been recording my own music since I was like a 10-year-old kid, I just didn't know the proper way to do anything until that point. So I became obsessed with like being technically good at the job, like you're trying to make records and make songs that sound as good as all the stuff that you listen to. And for a long time, it was about getting insanely tight sounding takes, punching notes, doing all this stuff, making the cleanest mix. But what's really funny about your question is it felt like nobody started caring about what I started to do until I like stopped caring about all that stuff and just focused more on the quality of the songs I was recording, like writing with bands, and then also like quote unquote breaking rules, like making stuff sounding bad almost purposefully, like using guitar tones that might sound more harsh to the ear or like drums that are blown out. And I'm thinking around like 2020 was when people started to like actually care about what I was doing, I'd say. So maybe 4 years or so.
So, but you say that like you shifted your focus to songs and breaking rules or whatever, but that's after years and years of learning how to do things properly.
Yes, which I think is definitely crucial. Like you have to learn the rules to then learn how to break them in a way that will be tasteful, Otherwise, you're just kind of like throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. But if you learn everything in a, technically sound way and then deviate from there, I think you can really start to be creative. And I know, there's a lot of engineers who would say that for sure.
Let me just say, as somebody who mixes a lot, you don't want to be the producer that doesn't know how to set the mic gain properly on a track, because when the mixer calls the artist and says, hey, how come the floor noise in the vocals is like half the signal? It doesn't look very good when you're charging thousands of dollars a song to do a production, and it's just not good. So, there's definitely a place for the technical stuff.
Yeah, it's almost like you need to get like everything on the way in needs to be rock solid, right? And then it's like the sculpting of like maybe the way that you did a guitar tone. And like what comes to mind is a band like Queens of the Stone Age, where they're like famously known for having these disgustingly sounding guitar and bass sounds
disgustingly
in a vacuum.
Awesome.
Yeah, they're incredible and they're unique, and they use these piece of shit combo amps for their stuff, but like it's creatively cool, it's tasteful. But like you're right, Joel, on the way in, like you have to know how to not clip your stuff, you have to know how to capture things with the right gain staging, all that. But for me, when I started to care less about like how pristine and like clean and like technical my productions became, and I just cared more about like the vibe, like the aesthetic, that's when people started to care more about my stuff.
I think it's the same as when people say with like music theory that learn it then forget it.
Yeah.
So that you don't write stuff that sounds like
scales.
The theory class.
I was just looking at like this whole thread about that exact topic, about how there's plenty of people who are insanely talented players or session musicians who, maybe they're not as dialed in at writing or like knowing what makes a song listenable or something. you know?
Yeah, and then you get people that are experts at theory who can't write worth a shit.
Yeah.
So the idea is, yeah, learn it, but then stop thinking about it. Once you learn it, just stop thinking about it because it's already in your DNA. Kind of like
Yeah.
if you take the technical approach with recording and then stop worrying about it as much, you still learned it. It's still there. So you're still building whatever you're building off of a good foundation, rather than just making some weird sloppy shit. Basically.
Yeah, it's like you have to do it to where it's like an intuition. Like when music theory people are writing, if they're like really awesome writers, they probably don't like sit around thinking about, you know, scales they're playing and the key that they're in and like which chords and the progression are going to be great. Just like how if I'm like going to produce a song for somebody, I'm not really thinking about where I'm setting my mic pre. There's just like a few positions depending on what I'm doing that I like, or the way that I set up my mic. Like I'm thinking more about like the actual end result and not like that technical moment. Like I'm not putting weight into those little technical decisions. It's just like becomes like an intuition almost, you know?
It's the same as like mixing, because sometimes people ask questions like, how do you get your snare to sound like this? And the answer is there's 1,000 different ways you could achieve that. It doesn't matter. You pick one, and if it doesn't work, you try something else. I think at a certain part, you build competence, right? And foundation and fundamentals. And then you train those. And then what happens is then you become an artist where you can just basically focus totally on being creative, come in and just achieve anything, because it's like, all right, well, I've been trying to get my snare to sound sick this way. It doesn't work. Let's try this. Let's try this. Let's try that, you know, and you're not limited by rules and constraints because you have the technical chops and the ability to just fully be creative.
Yeah. You don't even really think the things that other people might be thinking that you're considering when making those choices. You're not even in that headspace, you know, you're just flying through it. You're just being creative.
I've gotten people who analyze Doth songs and will hit me up and be like, did you think of doing this chord into this so that you moved into the next key, like X? No. No, it just sounded
cool. Guitar and it sounded good.
It sounded sick. Like, and some people have a really hard time with that idea of it just sounded sick, the end.
Yeah, I think what's cool too, I just got into a talk about something like that the other day where it's like sometimes you don't really recognize your intention until after, or like the meaning of a song that you wrote, or like why you made a certain decision. You might only be able to look at that in hindsight and be like, yeah, that's what this was coming from, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So out of curiosity, when you made that transition into worrying more about songs, quality of songs, was that a conscious decision, or was it something worked and then you noticed it worked? Like, what happened?
It was not a conscious decision. It's funny. Yeah, that's actually what happened. Like, I didn't know I was doing that at the time, but when I look back, it's clear to me. But at the time, it was just business as usual. And I think it was more a result of like getting my reps in and doing it over and over and over again. And the nature of doing stuff over and over, eventually you do it a little different and a little different and a little different. And then all of a sudden you do something that people care about, or you hope at least. You do something that gets people's attention, and then you go, oh, well, here's what I did that time around. Maybe I'm going to like keep that in mind on the next one. And then you keep doing that. And then for me, it was like that type of dynamic kept working when I did something. It was basically when I did the band Moodring. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the band Moodring, but that was kind of the band that started this entire thing for me to get to where I am now, was like doing that band, making those songs with them. It was the thing that people were like, oh, that guy does music, you know, he's not just like a guy in a band who can record local bands. It was like, oh, that guy made something, and now I want to pay attention to the next thing, you know?
Did a bunch of people come in wanting to sound like Moodring, or was it just people
until
like
this day? Yeah.
Okay.
It was that type of thing where it was like, hey, do this thing for me as well.
How does that go? Like, how do you feel about that?
I feel it's really weird because even though I'm not in the band Moodring, the singer Hunter has been like one of my closest friends since we were like 13 years old. We've been playing in bands together, and I've like helped write with tons of the bands that he's been in. So for me, it's like when we do music together, even though I'm not in the band, it feels like I'm in the band in very many ways. So it's always a struggle for me to like do things and like be the producer that these bands want me to be without like being derivative or like giving away the things that are special about Moodring, the band itself. So it's tough, but I do think at a bare minimum, it's like a really nice feeling to be desirable for your songwriting or your production or mixing or any of that stuff. Like that's a great thing in itself. So
yeah, I think bands who ask for something that another artist did, sometimes they just mean that they want to capture some sort of a similar feel to one of the aspects. But if they really mean make us sound like them, it's a tough pill for them to swallow, and we eventually learn that that's just not going to happen.
How do you handle a scenario where an artist comes in and they ask you to make them sound like something else you've done? For example, all the time people call me, they're like, dude, can you make me sound like this? And I'm like, okay, well, I could mix you like that, but you're not that band. So why don't we find something maybe in that lane or in that direction, but that's unique sonically to you? And that's interesting, that fits the songs that you've brought to me, instead of just blindly trying to copy the low end of something that you're not with the drum sound of something that you're not. And it's something that frustrates me because I feel like I know what they need to do, but you know how bands are. So when you're in that situation, but obviously as a producer, like how do you handle it, and how successful are you with them in terms of like how receptive the bands are to that type of mindset?
So it's interesting because on one hand, when I work on a thing, whether it's like helping write or producing, like there's such a part of me that's going to get into it regardless. And like I have that same thing happen with Moodring, for example. So I think in my head, the way I compartmentalize it is that I bring a part of me to every project, and then the other half is the artist or the band, and like that's where the differences lie. So I can make things be familiar. I can make things have a certain vibe, but ultimately that other half of the equation is always going to be slightly different because of the artist's taste and whatnot. And then the other part of it is just like for me to consciously to know like, okay, well, I do these certain things. I make these certain decisions with this band for a reason. And that doesn't mean that reason is just going to translate, you know, and, you know, having a genuine conversation about, the vision for whatever you're working on. Like, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? You know, those types of things.
You can't be someone you're not. I think that's sometimes a tough pill for artists to swallow.
Yep.
Because it means that you have to kind of be yourself. I just think, especially for artists that are developing, I mean, an artist is always developing, but in earlier years, it's before their identity is fully formed, it's easier to want to just take somebody else's identity.
100%, yeah.
Those of you watching, listening, we had some technical errors yesterday. The internet just died, so we're back now. It's the next day. And instead of trying to, I don't know, reimagine the place that we were at when the internet went out.
I remember the question I was asking.
I remember the question, but it was part of a flow. Let's just talk about something else. So, first of all, what's really challenging for you mix-wise right now? What's been the last thing that really has been grinding your gears as far as you're trying to get better at it and it's grinding you?
I feel like sometimes for me, I have like two parts to this. The first part is like trying to get something to be as full and exciting as possible without it sounding like a mess. But then the other part is always like in hindsight, like I'll listen back to a mix that maybe came out and I'm like, man, I wish the drum transients were just a little harder, you know? Like sometimes I feel like I always in hindsight wish that I made them knock harder or something like that. But yeah, as far as like what I'm currently doing, it's always one of those things of like trying to make it as big and full as possible, teetering the line of like, this sounds awesome and huge versus like, oh, this is just like breaking, you know?
Andy Sneap said that his method was to get things as clear as humanly possible. And once he got it to that point, dial everything back like 10%.
That, to me, I always struggle with the dialing back part. It like,
yep.
I never like to feel like I'm losing something cool in the process of trying to make something objectively better, which is kind of like going back into what we were talking about earlier, where it's like people stopped caring, or people started caring rather, when I like stopped following those rules of like make it clean and correct. So if I feel like I'm losing something by trying to make it better, I usually abandon that, you know, or trying to make it quote unquote better. But if I'm losing like something cool, like the aesthetic or the vibe, then I'm like, maybe I should try to come at this differently.
So do you basically put it like in terms of priority, vibe number one?
I always do, because I feel like the people who listen to music are like, they're going to pick up on that vibe within seconds. And, you know, most people who listen to music are not really critically thinking about production and mixing. And, you know, that's why it's important to me. At least I know for me, when I put a song on, within seconds, I know if I'm going to keep the song on.
Yeah, for sure. So is the vibe thing something that you have to think about, or
while I'm mixing, or
while you're mixing?
It's always kind of like in my mind, but you know, when you're in that flow state, you're maybe not super conscious of every little decision, but it's definitely like in my head, like you're chasing the vision of it and you're trying to find the sound that you hear in your head.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like it's one of those things that's kind of impossible to explain too.
Yeah.
You just kind of have to know, like you just kind of have to know what the target is.
Yeah.
I don't know. What about you, Joel? When you're chasing a mix, do you know, like, is there some ideal in your head?
Yeah, like for me, I'd equate it to something sounding wrong, if that makes sense. Like it doesn't sound right yet. And sometimes you can't necessarily put your finger on that. Like something just feels off. And then you just like working towards that. Like it's not hitting hard enough, or it's not connected, or it's not, you start identifying that, you know, like at URM, we like to use LDFC for listen, diagnose, fix, compare. So I always try to like think through that framework where it's like, okay, I hear something feels off to me. What is it that feels off? Is it, you know, are things not connecting? Are the balances off? Or, okay, the balances feel off. Okay, so now that we've diagnosed that, then I try to fix, like, what is it exactly in the balance doesn't feel right? Like, something's not connecting. Okay, it feels like maybe, you know, so I try to go through like a logical process when I'm doing it. But I mean, it's in real time. It's, you know how it is when you're doing this in half of seconds. You're just like, your brain goes. So yeah, I don't know. For me, it's just like, I mix a song until it feels like it's supposed to, where I hit play, I'm like, yeah, that feels like the song. This feels great. And I get in my car and I listen to it. I'm like, yeah, it's perfect. And then send it off.
I do think that sometimes the hang up is when you don't have that like vision from the get-go. And like, if you're trying to find it along the way, or maybe a band gives you a lot of creative liberty, you know, sometimes it's harder to get to that point because you're not exactly sure where you're going, and you kind of have to like dig it out instead of previewing. You have to almost like, you know, take it away until you find where the song is.
It's a very hard thing to do as a mixer because the really big producers, like people that crush it, most of them can turn in like an A- on a reference mix. And they're just like, don't ruin anything that we've done that we spent all this time working on. Just make it 10 to 15% better without really changing anything. And that's a majority of mixing at that level. And anybody who mixes like really high level stuff will tell you that. It's almost like you're almost like not mixing and not stepping on toes. But then you get the opposite dichotomy where it's like if you're mixing a self-produced band where they're like, hey, here's a bunch of MIDI and some DIs. We don't know what to do. Can you make it sound like, fill in the blank new band that just came out that has a really sick mix? And you're like, okay.
Yeah, I think
am I your producer or your mixer?
Yeah, it's interesting how quickly mixing just can turn into production, if you don't really have that discussion up front, especially with bands that are producing themselves,
Yeah.
All of a sudden they just expect you to do certain things and you're like, whoa.
So how do you handle that? Do you like get on the phone with them or do you just hear it and go for it?
That's a good question because there's this idea that got to do what you got to do to get the job done. But then there's also the whole thing of boundaries.
And that is actually one of the hardest things about the music industry. I was having a long talk with somebody about this who doesn't do music, and I had coffee with him and some buddies, and they were just asking questions and questions about the music. Questions and questions about the music industry, and it's like when you're talking to somebody who's not in it, they ask you these things like, oh, wouldn't you do this or do that? And you're like, yeah, the logical thing to do is that. But in this industry, there's all these other like contextual reasons you don't make the obvious decision that you would make. So, like you're saying, yeah, you should have boundaries. You should do this. You should do that. But like at the end of the day, are you going to like not send in a fucking awesome mix if it means you don't just put in a little extra work that's not going to create like multiple more email threads or then money talks? You're just like, if I just do this for like 20 extra minutes and just eat my pride, I'll do it. It'll be fine. It'll sound objectively better. But that being said, it is always like now these days, this is something that I didn't do in the past, which is definitely like the ways that I've grown is like always being way more upfront about the jobs you're doing and defining them and defining what their expectations are. So that way you never get into this weird thought you were supposed to do this and you didn't do this. I think that's like super important.
Probably the most important thing in communication with an artist or a producer, anybody I should say who's even creative, is upfront communication. Because if you lay out, for example, all of the payment terms and conditions, like, hey, we're on mix 14. I feel like my time is being taken advantage of. Like no one's going to be like, yeah, you're right. You did say that if we went and we got into crazy land, we're going to need to pay a little bit more. Like that expectation's already been set. Now it's not an uncomfortable conversation. Same thing creatively. Like, are we going to need to reamp guitars? Have you committed your sounds? Like, do you need any input or is it a finished production? It's so important.
Yeah. However, then you get into it and shit changes. And you have to read the room, and like Austin just said, there's contextual stuff going on. Like if you cause an email thread, the manager's on the email thread, is that like were there already like 6 other email threads about that production? Are you the email thread guy? And
exactly,
does that get to the label, and do the manager and the label start to think of you as the label thread guy, etc., which then
you really got to pick your battles.
Yeah, exactly. Like what that conversation you had with civilians the other day, it is pretty funny talking about music with people who live in the real world, because the rules are very, very different in music. They're unique to music, I think. And there's a lot of stuff that people would never put up with in any other field except for maybe Hollywood. I don't know, but
yeah, and probably every creative field to a degree has this like air of like, you know, it's professional, but sometimes it's extremely emotional, and you get caught up in that, and you know, you're like, wow, I can't believe I'm, you know, a quote unquote pro or whatever, and I've made it to this point or whatever. And it seems like it's actually more confusing and emotional. And there's all this like weird political stuff going on in the background. Yeah, it's very strange sometimes working in the music industry for sure. I mean, I think every musician that I know, whether it's like a band member or a producer or mixer or whatever, it's like being in the music industry is like sometimes like an abusive, toxic relationship, and we're always just trying to make the best of it, because if we didn't love it so much, and if it wasn't such a part of like who we are as like creatives or artists, there's no way that we could ever justify that dynamic. You know what I mean?
So how do you cope with that? And like, what is your, you know, we do this every day. So you know what it's like. You have days where you're like, I just worked 16 hours straight for 3 weeks, and I kind of want to just like jump off a bridge head first. You know what I mean? Like, what do you do to combat the insanity that we deal with on a daily basis?
Well, I'd be lying if I said that like I really have that figured out. It is like this ever evolving thing, and sometimes what helps me cope with something doesn't help me cope with something at a different time. Lately, you know, ever since I moved to LA, one of the best things about living here is just the amount of like engineer and producer friends that I have that are now like, we can hang out and get coffee and talk, and like finally I have people in my everyday life and circle who I can relate to, and we can all talk shit and like complain to each other about, you know,
Group
all the
therapy.
things that it literally is like group therapy. And like that, quite honestly, has been making me feel like at least, oh, you know, well, all my buddies know exactly how I feel. This is just the experience of a music producer in 2024. Which at the same time, you know, it's like I said about it being toxic. Like on one hand, yeah, it's great that all my friends and so many people can relate to me, but at the same time, it's like everybody feels this way. That's kind of sad. So, you know, but if I didn't have that, it would certainly be probably a lot more like weird self-isolation, just kind of frustrating things. I like to go out and, you know, hang out with friends and have coffee and like go swimming a lot lately. Just meeting up with people and talking and just trying to be like a normal person is sometimes all I need.
So the opposite of being in the studio, socializing.
Yeah. Well, what's crazy is like at the same time being in the studio.
That sounds very healthy. That sounds very healthy, by the way.
Yeah, we should try that sometime.
Yeah.
But I mean, at the same time though, for me, it's certainly different for everyone, especially if you're like a mixer only. But you know, the amount of like sessions that I do, like I get a lot of socializing time in sessions, and I do get that like I'm not super extroverted as a person, but I feel very like, you know, pumped up when I'm like hanging out with people all the time and doing writing sessions and production sessions, and I feel like, oh, I'm making awesome stuff with people I like. So in some ways, that is a lot of socializing, and that feels really good, but sometimes at the end of the day, it's still work. You still did work for like 12 hours a day, and you really need to prioritize. Like today, I'm not going to work today after this because I've worked every other day, and I need to just make sure I'm not working 7 days a week, or else I'm going to hate my life, you know? So just things like that, where it's like making sure you just force yourself to not, you know,
balance.
Burnt out. Yeah, balance. Like getting burnt out is so easy if you just like tell yourself, you'll lie to yourself, you'll justify whatever to get back in the studio and work, especially, you know, not to get too deep, but I know a lot of people, myself included, who really struggle with deriving their like self-worth from how much work that they get done. And if that's the type of person you are and you're in the audio industry, like you're fighting an uphill battle, because like I'll justify whatever to like be like, I just got to get this done. I just got to do this. And when I get work done is when I feel my best. And that's why for me, I've recognized like I have a tendency to do that. I have a tendency to kind of lie to myself and get work done so I feel really great about myself. And that's not sustainable. And I need to like prioritize, time to just be a normal person and just, exist outside of the studio.
You made a good point there that I want to reiterate here. I think I remember back when I used to produce before I was just a dedicated mixer. And you're right. When you're in the studio hanging out with people all day, like I never felt like socially isolated. And as soon as I started mixing and I'm by myself, and I've realized with my other friends who are mixers and especially mastering people, it's like, those are the people that call me at 10 o'clock at night to just talk about something technical, just so they can talk to somebody. You know what I mean? It's like we're sitting around. It's like we haven't seen anybody other than like our assistant, but it's different because you're not, when you see somebody every day for 10 years, it's like, what, it's just work. But that's a real thing where when you're just by yourself mixing, you have mastering, you have no social interactions with actual humans other than like going online and just raging about things or whatever.
Yeah. You know what I think is really important too is like, even though you can be a person who is, maybe you're a producer or a writer and you're constantly in groups of people, I think kind of the other side of this that we haven't mentioned is what's important about socializing outside of that is like kind of like reminding yourself and grounding yourself in the reality that like there's people out there that you can be around that have nothing to do with music, have nothing to do with gaining something from you. Because you can fall into that trap of like, oh, I'm with all my friends and I'm having such a good time. But the caveat is like, these are all people that are hiring you and people that they're there for you to do a job. And so, socializing outside of that and really making sure you're spending time with people outside of that is really healthy for making sure that you have those dynamics in your life that aren't dependent on you being hired. That's
true. Like if you realize that the only reason you're hanging out with someone is because you're working together and otherwise you'd have zero contact. It's not to say that your relationship's fake. It's not fake.
Right.
It's just it's got boundaries. Your friend, you're like work friends, which is fine, but it's not an actual social circle.
Yeah, like it can be both, but it's not always going to be both. And I think that, sometimes producers or whoever the type of person is in that scenario can, fall into thinking that it's a certain way that it's not, or like thinking like, oh, this person's like my genuine friend. And maybe they are, maybe they're not, who knows, really, everybody's different in that situation. But like, you can think that it's a certain way. And then, maybe certain business stuff comes up and you're like, oh, in my head, I thought a certain type of friend wouldn't do this. And then it's like, well, we are friends, but we're not genuinely like friends. Like this is a business thing first, and it can just get slippery. I've never really had anything crazy happen to where it's like studio stuff gets weird. In fact, most of my closest friends in my life are from the studio, but there is like this little section of my life that is not studio related at all, and I think it's just super valuable to keep going back to that same well and like fill the needs of just human friendship that's like not connected to like whether or not you're gonna help them facilitate something in their life creatively.
Yes, I do know. That sounds very, very healthy. I recommend it for everybody. I don't have it, but I recommend it for everybody.
It's at least something to like really think about and consider, because being aware of it is like just the first step. And because for a long time, I totally wasn't, it wasn't something I thought about. But the older I get, the more that type of stuff is on my mind. It's like anything that has to do with longevity.
You. I have this issue when I get around people that aren't involved in this mission. I just get bored as fuck.
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah. I get so bored. I've tried to get better about it because,
Dude, it's hard.
I have to do some things like, I'm not going to say what in case this gets played. Heard
when I go to
people.
like soccer practice with my
That's
kid,
what I'm saying.
Dude,
man,
people look at me like I'm a mutant. Like, I don't know how to talk to normal people.
So Austin, I totally agree with what you're saying. And I do think that's the healthy thing is to have a social circle outside of music that's not dependent on what you're going to do for them. That's just there for you.
Mm-hmm.
You like each other because you like each other. I have found, that, and this is probably a personality defect on my part. I get so fucking bored. Get so fucking bored. Maybe I've been hanging out with the wrong people or something.
You got to get into sports.
Yeah.
Well, I don't even necessarily think it's just like, oh, you got to be doing stuff outside of music. That's a whole nother topic of conversation. But I just, at the bare bones of it, it's like, I love hanging out with my producer friends, but we're not working with each other,
Fair enough. Yeah.
Like, we're hanging out because we like to hang out. It's not because so-and-so is going to hire so-and-so and we have to like be friends and do this. It's just, just being friends for the sake of being friends and not getting money and, partnerships involved.
Definitely a perk of being in a music hub like LA or Nashville. I think if you're one of the many people watching this where you're kind of like in the middle of some small town in Ohio, just making records, you know what I mean? That's when I think things become more isolated. It's like, EYAL and I are in Wisconsin of all weird places. And there's nothing here musically other than us and like one or two other people that are kind of
Nick Rad's here. And
like, I'll hang out with Nick sometimes. He's such a great guy, but it's like, he has a family, he has a life. I have a family. We don't just get together every weekend and go out for a drink and talk about the battles of mixing,
Right. Yeah. Especially like the older you get, like the more it's not really expected to deviate from that, and which I get. And but even so, like I'm from Florida and I knew a lot of people in the music industry, or I knew a lot of producers in Florida, but it was more like the people in my like daily life just weren't really, they didn't get it. They didn't relate.
No, I think that's awesome to have a group of friends that you can actually relate with. That's really, really killer, actually.
Yeah, there's nothing better than feeling like you live in a place where your career path is like totally validated compared to like when I lived in Tampa, every person I knew in real life was like working quote unquote real jobs, 9-to-5s, and you get perceived as doing kind of more of like a hobby thing, especially like, everybody knows what it's like to be a musician and go to Thanksgiving and they're like, how's the music thing going?
How's your little group?
Yeah.
People ask me like, what do you do for a living? Like, oh, I'm a mixer. They're like, oh, do you DJ weddings? And I'm like, yeah, I here's my card.
That's actually why we suggest in the URM community that people have meetups in their towns or states.
I'm sure that's great for
it like, is, especially for people who live not in LA or Nashville or something. I mean, the LA and Nashville chapters are awesome, but I think especially for people who don't live in a hub like that, it's really, really hard to find like-minded people. So I think lots of people have made friends, like real life friends, and then also have started working together as a result of them. But it kind of fulfills that thing we're talking about right now.
Mm-hmm.
It is a pretty isolated lifestyle in lots of regards.
Yep, and you can watch your life just kind of like pass you by because of how much time you spend in the studio. It's almost like, how they say time flies when you're having fun, and you're like, oh, well, I spend 12 hours in the studio every day, and then all of a sudden, and if you genuinely love what you do, it's like all of a sudden you look back and you're like, dang,
It's
You know,
August.
there goes 10 years or whatever. Like,
And all you have left is a stream count.
Yeah. We started this podcast 10 years ago this year.
Oh my God. For real?
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Wild.
For real.
It's been 10 years?
Dude, yeah.
Which is why it's so cool to like come on the podcast and talk with you guys. Cause like I was one of those people who listened back then, you know?
It's crazy.
Wow.
When? Back in like 2015 and stuff?
Yeah. 2016, I believe,
Back in
was
the
like when
day.
I was listening regularly.
Well,
Can't
my
believe
hair
it's
isn't
been
all
that
gray yet, so
You're doing great.
still got some mileage left.
So we are starting to run out of time. How do you feel about doing rapid fire
Sure.
on some gear and
Yeah, sure.
tech talk?
All right. So
All right.
I'll ask you a question. You tell me what and then why. Deal?
Okay. Okay. Yeah, sure.
All right. Ready?
Mm-hmm.
Set your timer. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Favorite compressor and why?
Just like general purpose or just
Up to
certain
you.
stuff. I can tell you certain stuff that I like.
Up to you. Just whatever
Yeah.
comes to mind.
Vocal, 1176.
Blue or black?
Black. I just got a Rev F URI recently,
Nice.
and I love it so much.
That
Mixed bus?
is a nice one.
Yeah, I love it. Mixed bus would be SSL. Lately, drums is Audioscape Decomp. It's like kind of, from what I understand, it's supposed to be like the Chandler. Is it the Z limiter?
Zener limiter? Yeah.
Yeah, I believe
That's a great compressor. Dave Otero loves that one.
That's right. Yeah, he does use that. That's kind of my drum thing at the moment. I love. I also love Sound Toys Devil Lock. It's like one of my favorite compressors ever to use. So yeah, for compression, that's kind of like my favorite go. Oh, I also love using Distressor for drum.
Can't go wrong with a distressor ever.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question. Favorite amp or amp sim?
Oh, favorite amp is.
You can only have one.
I can only have one.
You can only
Yep.
have one.
Amp or amp sim or amp.
Amp or amp sim. Just whatever rocks. And the answer is
All
Pod
right.
Farm, but carry on.
Yeah, I'm sure that. I'm not surprised you'd say that. I'm gonna have to say, man, JCM 800.
Dude.
Not bad.
Oh, love that amp.
Yeah.
Okay. Best plug-in EQ.
Hold on. Modded or not?
Mine is not modded.
With something in front?
Yeah, always
Okay.
some cool pedal. Actually, I would
You
love
can
to
use that
show
without
you.
a pedal
I'd
in
love
front?
To show you.
Well, you would have to, if you don't use something in front, you kind of got to mod them.
This is my pedal in front. It's
What
a
is
custom pedal.
That is cool.
I will not elaborate, but I just wanted you guys
Full
to see.
bat signal. Does
Well,
it call?
it's got a Batman logo on it.
Yeah, it's basically a boost, distortion, and a fuzz. Or no, it's a boost, an octave, and a fuzz.
Ah.
I can get some crazy stuff going into a
Yeah, I've
Marshall
heard-
with that thing.
JCMs that modded JCMs that you don't need to use anything in front of because they're just fucking
Yeah.
godly. But then I've never heard an unmodded one sound good without something in front of it. But
Yeah, it depends
it's-
what you're going for too.
it depends what you're going for. I have a heavy guitar tone in my head, but
Yeah,
it's a great amp.
I love it so much.
Okay. Best plug-in EQ.
I'm gonna go ahead and just give that to Make Believe with the Soundtech plugin.
Great plug-in.
Yeah, I gotta shout them out.
Okay. If you had to pick one vocal mic, what would it be?
If I had to pick one, man, I'm inclined to say like an SM7, even though I don't like the way that thing sounds anymore, but it's like worked on so many different things and so many different types of people. And it just how sometimes the singer sounds terrible on like a $10,000 mic.
Mhm.
No,
It's like one of the, yeah.
but yes.
It's one of those things. I'm inclined to say if I had to only have one mic forever, it might be something more utility like that.
I know exactly what you're talking about, where the really nice and condensers on when they're paired with the wrong type of vocalist will bring out everything you don't want to hear
Sibilance.
about that vocalist.
Yeah.
Or like if they're like particularly nasally or breathy or whatever, like it's just you have to match. You got to match them
Yeah.
correctly. You got to pair the mic to the vocalist a lot more, I think, with condensers. And SM7B is just, it's just like a hammer that works on all different types of nails. Basically, it's not as pristine, but it just kind of works.
It was like kind of like my main vocal mic for a really long time, so I kind of got sick of it. But it's crazy the amount of records that you'll find out that was used, and you're like, dang, that sounds amazing. Like, I guess it's on me to make it sound better, or like the vocalist or whoever. Like, there's no excuse, I guess, you know.
And SM7 just always works. And I always know I'm going to use a ton of EQ on it going in, but it's just never going to fail. Okay, last question. What, in your opinion, is the best sounding mix of all time?
Dang, the best sounding mix of all time?
You only get to pick one.
Oh my God.
I couldn't answer this question.
Oh man.
It's kind of an unanswerable question, but if you had to pretend like there was a best mix of all time, what would the pretend answer be?
I feel like there's something that I'm like that is so obvious that I'm like forgetting right now.
We broke him.
The tension. It really is kind of an unfair question, though, because
what's your favorite mix then?
Yeah,
I'm right now, the mix that is just like inspiring me over and over again is the Audio Slave Rich Costi mix. Like, I don't know if I would say that's the best mix of all time, but like, it's up there. It's in a conversation of like best rock mixes or something.
it could be submitted to the committee.
There's also a mix. Let me just do my homework real quick. Let's see. Rent I Pay by the band Spoon. That's a mix that every time I listen to it, I am just like, I wish that I mixed this. I wish that I could have produced this. I wish I could have been the person who made this. Stuff like that. Or like, you know, fucking, I don't know, like Hybrid Theory by Andy Wallace might be one of the best sounding things of all time. Like, I don't know, there's so much there. I don't even know.
I feel like every time we say Andy Wallace in this podcast, there should be a 2-second pause to admire the greatness.
Yeah. Dude, he's incredible.
Unreal, man. It's just unreal.
Yeah, it definitely one of the GOATs. All right, man, Austin, thank you very much for taking the time to hang out with us and for doing a part 1 and a part 2. It's been a pleasure.
Heck yeah, thanks for having me on.
Anytime.